so frightened of losing everything. And it's really hard to explain to people that don't understand OCD, but I was literally living in a nightmare where any moment I would be taken away from my family. And it got to a point where even driving, I was driving and then driving back to check that I hadn't hit someone, or because I was so paranoid of accidentally hitting someone and doing a hit and run and then being put in jail and being taken away from my family.
That was Janaya, and you've landed on the Me and My Health Up podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Harcher, a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And today we have Janaya, who's a naturopath and a specialist in OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. We discuss her journey, her story around discovering after 30 years that she had OCD and how she's gone about recovering from her OCD. So this is a really insightful discussion with Janaya. We talk about OCD, what it is, what to look out for, and how to go about getting support and help. And Janaya is an expert and specialist in this area. So buckle up and join me and Janaya for this insightful conversation on OCD. Welcome on the Me and My Health Up podcast. How are you, Janaya?
I'm good, thanks, Anthony. How are you?
Fantastic. So great to have you on the show and really looking forward to our insightful discussion on OCD and all about your journey and how you've arrived at what you're doing today. And for the listeners, I've known Janaya for a long time. We went to uni together. We studied together, did lots of herb subjects together and had lots of fun. And we still stay in touch, I guess, post-qualifications and out in the real world practicing. So really excited to have this discussion with Janaya. And so just please share with the listeners how you've arrived at what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. So I was studying naturopathy for 10 years, part-time while I was living my life, working, having children and so forth. And I guess in the meantime, once I finished my degree, actually, I realized I had OCD. So we worked out I've probably had it for 20 years since I was about 18. It just got worse over time. I would go and over the years, I saw many, therapists, GPs and whatever. And it was always, you've got anxiety. I tried some SSRIs a long time ago and they didn't really help me. And sometimes actually the treatment I was getting for anxiety with psychology and so forth, it actually made it worse. So I think over the years, I just kind of lived like this and I struggled sometimes more than others, especially when I was more stressed out. And then, I had a baby and I was giving up my career that I had, and I took some time out and I was studying full time, and then I had another baby, and then eventually I cracked. I got so bad to the point where getting up in the morning was a struggle, and I had 2 young children, and I would be so frightened of losing everything. And it's really hard to explain to people that don't understand OCD, but I was literally living in a nightmare where any moment I would be taken away from my family. And it got to a point where even driving, I was driving and then driving back to check that I hadn't hit someone, or because I was so paranoid of accidentally hitting someone and doing a hit and run and then being put in jail and being taken away from my family. Because had I really hit someone, I would have gone back and helped. You know what I mean? But in my mind, I was like, I was so worried that I hit someone without knowing. So that's, and then I listened to a podcast. Well, actually, my husband, he had said over the years, I think you might have OCD. I think you might have OCD. And again, I didn't know much about it. I would talk to therapists and whatever, and they were like, no, you don't have OCD. And then I was listening to a podcast that my husband sent me a few years ago, and I was like, oh my God, this is me. Like, this person is telling my story. And she was talking about how she recovered from OCD, and I just straight away found a therapist that specialized in a particular therapy called ERP, which is exposure, response, and prevention therapy. And I started seeing her weekly for about 3 months. I was still really struggling. So I went on SSRIs. We played with the dose of those over 6 months or so. And then, I don't know, about 6 to 8 months in, I was starting to feel better and I reduced my therapy, and all the while I was using naturopathy as well. And I guess, I don't know, I'd say from a year after I started to when I finished, I would consider myself recovered now. But it's a daily, I don't know, management system, you know? So, yeah, that's how I got to where I've got to, because I can see how naturopathy can help a lot of the symptoms of OCD. And I'm a big believer of it takes a toolkit, not a tool. And I just want to help anyone out there that's struggling with OCD, because I get it. It is tough, especially because it's so misunderstood.
Yeah, so let's get into the definition first as
Yes,
to
sure.
what OCD is, just for those that
Okay.
aren't across it. Yeah.
Yeah, so OCD it's a mental health condition, it's a psychiatric disorder, and it's characterized by having obsessions, which are persistent, they're intrusive, and they're often really irrational, followed by compulsions. So they're like repetitive behaviors or mental acts that feel urgent, like if they're not done, what they're thinking about could happen. So, and when I say irrational, I mean, I would tell my husband some things that I was thinking about, and he was just like, I do not understand how your brain even comes to those conclusions. Like,
Can you share, if you don't mind?
yeah, sure, I'll share some. So mine were always around doing something that could cause harm, and then often taking it that little bit further, that would then impact my life as well. So if I was in a shopping centre and I spilt a drink, I would literally have to go find a cleaner, talk to that cleaner, take them to the spot, make sure that they clean it up. Like, I'd be watching to make sure they cleaned it up, because I couldn't have someone fall over and it be my fault. So that's one type of example. Or accidentally leaving a gate open at my child's kindergarten. You know, there's a door and a gate, but if I left the gate open, I'd be going back and checking all the time, because I wouldn't want to be responsible for a child getting out and getting lost or being hit by a car. Hit and run, like I told you about. I know most people sit there and they say you would know if you hit someone, but I'd go over a bump or something and go, oh my God, what happens if that was actually a person? And I would drive back again and again and again and again to check, trying to see, seeking reassurance for something I'd done or thought about. And sometimes that meant confessing. So I would, many nights, I'd be in there with my husband going, I did this today and then this happened and this happened. Do you think that this could happen? And he'd be like, oh God, you're right. But eventually we learned that by him giving me reassurance was making it worse as well. Mentally reviewing, going over memories, preparing for the worst case scenarios. So I would often write pages and pages of what I would say, what I would do if this happened, or if this happened, or if this happened. I hope this is making sense.
It makes
a little bit.
It makes a lot of sense, Janaya. I'm just wondering how it got missed. Like, for me, yes.
I don't know. No, I mean, it got worse over time. Like, the way I say it to people is, you know that old saying that used to be on ads, I don't know if it is anymore, about every cigarette is doing you damage, right? Every compulsion is doing you damage. So it almost becomes like an addiction, and it's the only way you can live your life is if, okay, I have a thought, I have to do this action. I do a thought, I have to do this action. I think it was missed because, you know, I only learned what OCD was when I heard that podcast, and then I went and did my own research. But, you know, I always thought it was needing to be clean or things in order, and I'm not like that at all. Sure, I like things to be organized, but the difference is I would have a thought of what happens if I hit someone and didn't know about it. And instead of going, oh, well, I would know and move on, I would literally have to go drive back and check. Or, yeah, it's always, I think the other things that are linked is like catastrophic thinking, you know, black and white reasoning. Like, you're either wrong or you're right. There's no in between. And there's total overestimation of threat. You know, it would be like, in my experience, it was there could be 500 different things that could happen in a scenario, and I would have to work out each one, whether it was 99% chance or 1% chance. I had to work out every single chance as if they were even. Yeah. So in answering you on how it got missed, I'm not sure. I wondered if I never really went into the compulsions because I didn't realize they were compulsions. I would talk about my thoughts, but I wouldn't talk about my compulsions because I just thought that was normal.
Fair enough. I mean, if you're not aware, you don't know. And it really starts with that self-awareness. And obviously your husband was observing your behaviors and thinking, it just doesn't seem right. There's something not right here. And he got a little, I guess, inkling that it was, it could be OCD and was starting to share that with you and sowed the seed. And then you started to look out for OCD and better understand it. And
and I really did raise it a few times. And it was always just, nah. Like I remember they tested me for ADD at one point because the thoughts are all consuming. You're thinking about, you're never present. You're thinking about something in the back of your head, but, again, it got missed there.
For me, what I'm hearing is it's really that fight, flight, or freeze syndrome that's really locked in. It's like in overdrive.
Yeah, my poor little adrenals, I swear, they were just a wreck.
To the point where you really got so burnt out, you had that chronic fatigue, you couldn't get out of bed. Like it just ran you down that much,
It just ran me down that much. And it was almost like whenever I had a happy moment, because there's all these things, like I would be triggered by joy. So I look at OCD as a real bully. That's just how I've got to it in my life. And it would, whenever I was playing with my daughter and she was giggling or something, I'd have the thought of, this could all be taken away. Thought, compulsion. Like it was just relentless, basically. And then it just made me disappointed in trying to enjoy myself because it's almost like my OCD is better when I'm unhappy.
So I was just thinking, like you said, you've traced this back to when you were 18. Was there a particular event that happened back then?
Not that I can remember. I mean, it was around the time that I had finished school. So, that is a big transition. But no, I can't. And it started small. I say small, but, I would check the iron was off and I would check anything that could cause fire and cause harm to others, making sure the doors were locked and things like that. And, I would do that. And sometimes, like I can remember in my early 20s, driving back to work because I was responsible for locking up. So I was like 45 minutes away, driving back to work at midnight, checking that the door was locked. Like it was at that time, I thought it was just a little bit of anxiousness, but that's really not normal.
Yeah, and it sort of, for me, it probably goes back to those early years of life with the interactions with your parents. And
I was always a worrier, I'm very observant with my children because there is a genetic component. So I'm always like, don't worry about that, don't worry. Because, I can remember I was always a worrier. Like, I remember my grandfather used to call me, Janaya the worry wart. So it's obviously, it was there and it just needed to be triggered.
Yeah, wow.
And then, like I said, the habits, just habit after habit, and the more you do it without treatment, I guess it makes it worse.
Well, it does, it's that reinforcing, and it just becomes
reinforcing behavior. Exactly,
as you said, it becomes normal. It's who you are. You go, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just
normal, and it takes you half an hour to leave the house and 45 minutes to do a 10-minute trip, and and I think that's where I also it got to the point where I was looking into having a stay at a psychiatric facility because. I would be in the car with my girls and my older daughter, who was about 4 at the time, would be like, Mum, we've driven past this so many times. And that's where I was like, I can't do this to them. I cannot do this to them because this is just insane.
Yeah, wow. It's full on. Like just hearing your stories and how debilitating that is. Like you don't have any control of yourself. You're possessed, like you.
It was like I was possessed. Yeah.
And I was just thinking back because obviously I could see, you did really well at your studies. I was studying with you, and it was probably that thing that look at all possibility scenarios and make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and hence.
Honestly, Anthony, I can remember doing assignments and like having that at that last, 10:30 at night before Sunday. Oh no, I've got to change this, and I changed it all, and it'd be in at 11. Oh, honestly, I still have PTSD from putting in assignments.
Well,
and then sometimes I'd write to a lecturer the next day saying, "Oh, I've submitted it, but I'm not happy with it. Can I redo it?" And they're like, "No." Or sometimes they would give me extension, but it was just like, just leave it.
Yeah, wow. No, well, I could only ever see your marks, or not see your marks, but knew you were doing well. So it was. I was thinking, well, it certainly served you to a point with your studies. It certainly made you excel.
It did, but it was. I would have taken that. I would have taken that away. Like, I think it goes back to. I think about this a lot. Black and white thinking. It's I'm going to either pass or fail. There was no in between. So if I didn't answer the question exactly right, I would fail. Not, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I just couldn't deal with that ambiguity.
So knowing what you know today around the condition, and as you said, you've got this expansive toolkit to work with now. It's not just a single tool. You've got this expansive toolkit. How would you go about treating Janaya? So just walk us through it in terms of how you'd help someone with OCD today.
Okay, so, well, like I said, the cause of OCD is unknown. The triggers are unknown. It's like most chronic conditions. It's thought to be a range of things, whether it's genetics or, their brain chemistry, their nature, upbringing, trauma, you name it. It could be that. So it depends on the person. And what I love about naturopathy is you get to sit down with your clients and talk to them and go through their medical history, their personal history. You get that time to really go through all the things that could have impacted their life. And then from there, you would just kind of work through it, basically. So, for me, one of the biggest things for the entire time was, even before I knew I had OCD, it was worse pretty much from when I ovulated to when I got my period. It got gradually worse. And then when I had my period, it was such a relief. And it was almost like I was normal again. So that was the first area I started working on, was on my hormones. And, it was so bad that when I was taking medication, I had to double my medication, took like the last 7 days. And now I don't need to do that. So that's one thing that I've managed to sort out. But I guess it's like the main things I would look to work on with someone, and I've done on myself, it's calming, nourishing, and regulating the nervous system. And when we talk about the nervous system, it's like it's maintaining the balance not only within the brain and the spinal cord, but also the gut microbiome, because they're so linked. And that gut-brain axis, there's so much the microbes do with producing and signaling the neurotransmitters. So that's a really important part. I would say one of the most important parts. And then obviously supporting the HPA axis, hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis, to restore regulation, because we are in fight and flight so much. It is just more than anyone I can imagine. You know what I mean? It's just constant. And then regulating hormones, as I said. So you can do that in a number of ways, whether it's, sorting out their detoxification or elimination pathways, or even just using substances that modulate hormones in the body, regulating nutritional levels. So, iron levels, they can be too high or too low. Either way plays havoc. And another interesting one is cholesterol. So we all know cholesterol and the damage it can do when it's too high, but it can also be too low. And there is an association with low cholesterol and people with OCD. But also I was looking at research recently, and, it's associated with aggressive behavior. And it makes sense to me. But, that's a factor. So that's another way. And then rebuilding self-confidence and through self-care. One of the biggest things I noticed towards my break, I say, was, you are constantly doubting your thoughts and your actions every day. So imagine what that does to someone's self-confidence. It's just, you don't feel like you're worthy almost. So that was another big area. Reducing inflammation, if there's any digestive discomfort, looking into that further, resolving whether it's leaky gut or constipation, dysbiosis, as I talked about before. And then finally, just supporting mitochondria health, which I've heard you talk about before. So that's for your listeners, mitochondria, they're the tiny little power plants in our cells, and they generate energy for everything we do in the body. So, when you're constantly stressed and expending all that extra energy, they just need a little bit of love and a little bit more support, really. And I think that's like the main things you'd look at. That's a lot, you know what I mean? So you can see how all of that, alongside therapy, alongside SSRIs if they're needed, it's going to improve your overall health and well-being. And so, you'd hope, and it has in my case, improved my life, basically. My life now, before I knew I had OCD, I could never have imagined living the life I have now. I feel so free. I could never imagine running my own business. I don't even think I could imagine supporting people's health because I'd be too frightened, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I can't even explain. It's just unimaginable how much better my life is now.
Yeah, wow. It's incredible how your life has just turned around, and in essence, it's really helped propel you forward now.
Completely.
Yeah.
And I think even this time last year, I was dabbling with the idea of maybe I could, start a naturopathy business. But then as I got into it, I was like, yeah, I can do this. And then I started getting more confident because I was like, oh my God, look how much it's helping me. I want to help other people. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. I was just thinking when you mentioned hormones and how
Yes.
it was very much linked to the second part of the hormonal cycle. Is there a tendency for women to be more prone to OCD than men, or there's?
Look, that's an interesting question. I think when you're younger, they tend to see more OCD in men, but I think they are finding women come out later. So a bit like me. So they may have had it for a long time, but they haven't realised they've had it. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's a lot also linked to trigger. A big trigger can be giving birth. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Because I was just thinking that you've got that transition out of, I guess the womanhood, the perimenopause phase, and with the rapid sharp inclines in estrogen and rapid drops in estrogen, and this fluctuation of estrogen all over the place must cause that sort of coming out, so to speak, for women that have been, just managing it or just getting by for all those years, and then all of a sudden it just becomes intolerable because they just don't have the estrogen there anymore, or to the levels they used to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big part of it. And I think the other part, especially with the after giving birth, it's definitely the hormones, but it's also that you're responsible for something else now, It's that whole, and like in my case, my children brought me joy. So that was a trigger.
Yeah, because you didn't want that taken away. You feared the loss.
It was almost, the more I had, the more I was scared of losing it. Maybe that's why it wasn't so bad when it was just me. Because I can remember before I had children, I would worry a lot about my relationship, That was the most important thing to me. So
but then that transformed into the kids, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Or the whole family unit,
yeah.
The whole family unit.
Just got bigger.
Yeah.
Yes. More to worry about.
More to worry about.
Not just hubby. It's got the kids as well.
Exactly.
And now I've got a second.
I remember saying to myself, because I did travel quite a bit on my own when I was in my late 20s. And it was just me. And I had no house to look after. I had nothing to look after, just have a good time. And it honestly was probably the most freeing part of my life because I didn't have a job. I didn't have, all these things. So even then I can remember stressing out that I had left my passport somewhere or whatever. But, it was a much easier part of my life.
Yeah, I could see that. And I could see how it gets diagnosed later now that you've shared that sort of growing responsibilities, more, that fearing that loss of more. You've got more to lose in essence.
And I have to say, like, OCD presents so differently for so many people. There's all these themes. So, what I'm talking about could be very different to someone else's experience. A lot of people are worried about contamination and germs, and other people, they call it false memory OCD, where they can't remember things. Or I put myself in the harm because mine's around harm, but it can switch and it can change. And I did find as well, like when I went on the SSRIs, like I said to you, I found OCD to be a real bully. So the more I was resisting the compulsions, which is all part of the therapy, it was fighting back with a vengeance. So I would say for probably the first 4 months, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then 5 steps forward, 10 steps back. It was a real getting over, and managing OCD was definitely one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but it's been the best.
And there's a saying that says that what we resist persists, and I think that's what you experienced during the SSRI journey.
Yeah, I think I needed them to resist. I cannot explain it. Like I started with the easier things. So it would be leaving the house without checking everything. And to me, that was really hard, but that was one of the easier things. So that's how you start. You start step by step. And then towards the end, it was like, going over a speed bump or whatever and not driving back. And then it was not reviewing in the review mirror, and then, so it was a long, long process, but it was well worth it.
Yeah, 100%. It's a journey, and you've embarked on that journey. You've conquered it, and now you're out there saving others. You're the hit.
Yes.
It's been so great to have you on, Janaya. How can the listeners best connect with you?
You can connect with me on my website, which is Janaya Karloci naturopath.com.au. You can connect with me on Instagram and Facebook. If you have OCD, I would suggest following me on Instagram and looking at who I follow. I have a number of amazing advocates, people who provide free support on OCD, which I have to say also very much helped me during my journey, to know that you're not the only one out there. And they give some great tips, these guys. So
fantastic.
That's it.
I'll make sure that all those links you mentioned are in the show notes so that the listeners can go directly to your Facebook page or your Instagram page and follow the followers.
Yes, please do. They're great, some of them.
Awesome. So great to have you on, Janaya, and really awesome to hear that you've recovered and now you're out helping others, which is fantastic. So keep up the great work. Keep flying the flag in terms of supporting those in need around OCD, and look forward to talking to you again in the future sometime.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand me&my Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. me&my Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you may to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information. Changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, me&my Health Up disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast, and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages, or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of me&my Health Up.